if some of the people I knew would see me looking frail and old, and then subsequently a year later would see me looking energized and younger and filled with energy, they would say, Merlin is magical. He is living his life backwards and he gets younger every time we see him. All they were seeing was the result of a process whereby I would refresh myself for the next 100 years. You understand that many times the story becomes more important and more vibrant and more influential than what actually happened. This is sometimes a good thing as intentions and iconic truths are magnified, which can be more easily recognized when something becomes lore or myth.
Welcome, this is Rachel Chamness, your host of this channel, Sound Waves Heal, and this video is a spotlight for a master practitioner at Sound Waves Heal who has completed most or all of my courses and is a master channel. You'll find a new video almost every Saturday of a practitioner or a current student, as it's my mission to empower and uplift my students.
Good afternoon, fellow pilgrims. On this beautiful Friday, it's exciting to be here with you again today. Merlin is very excited because you all know him from his time in the story of Camelot, but he wants to speak to you more of what some of the truths in the legend are and answer some of your questions about the lore and mystery, which has been passed down over many centuries and changed to suit the agendas of the people passing down the information. And so by telling you truths about it, you may understand how it applies to us today and what the original intentions and the original truth of Camelot was. I've already surrounded myself with the bubble that Sandalphon provides from our Earth Star chakra, and they hold us in a space that is sacred and be safe and feel secure and feel as if we open to the highest possible wisdom. I've been talking to Merlin. 2 weeks ago, he wanted to give you some background about what the history of the earth was like, what happened after the fall of Atlantis, how himself being one of many refugees and refugee groups that fled from Atlantis as it fell and set up sacred places across the earth to hold some of the wisdom and artifacts of Atlantis and to continue some of the rituals of Atlantis so that there would at least be light saved for the future. In the meantime, there was a parallel experience going on where mankind, another evolution of mankind, was seeded by different star seeds, as we have tapped into a little bit at a time in TAG, and was evolving new kinds of souls in form, but very forgetful with some of their chakras closed down and some of their DNA strands closed down so that they would not know of their absolute origin in source and in high spiritual realms. But they were trying to evolve, and at the time, they only basically knew survival. There was much lower energy generated from fear and the survival instincts, trying to adjust to their home on Earth, the difficulties of making life happen, basically on Earth, of feeding themselves and being sheltered from wild beasts and weather and every kind of challenge. And so therefore they evolved with a lot of fear, a lot of ego to try to protect them from things. And so that resulted in conflict, in territorial dispute, in violence, in taking what was for you and your family and not worrying if that meant you were hurting others. There were different communities that tried to be peaceful and tried to be soulful. And there were many different sort of religious threads evolving, ways of explaining what the people saw and felt in their hearts about the cosmos and about their origins and about some kind of master plan and some to not have a better vision. But they had forgotten much of, or never learned in these lifetimes, the wisdom that Atlantis was trying to preserve. And Atlantis was trying to preserve it for a future time when mankind would be ready to receive and understand all of the wisdom they had achieved in the golden years. So that's where he left us. I'm going to bring him in now to continue. I will just tell you that I've been trying to ask him questions that you left about the legend, about the details of the legend and all the things that I know about the legend, because I've been reading it all my life in different forms. And I got as much as I could out of him. And there are some things that he's sort of just leaving a little ambiguous that I'm not sure we're going to get out of him exactly. Like he doesn't want to pin it down in a time frame exactly. But a lot of the other stuff is going to ring very true to you because that's some of the things he said. I kind of had light bulb moments and went, oh yeah, that makes total sense. So I will bring him forward, and he's going to concentrate today on the actual the arrival of Arthur, the story we know, all the different elements of it, and why it happened, and what it was supposed to achieve, and whether it did achieve anything, and whether that impacts us today. Okay, so if you're ready for this, I'm here. I'm going to get one. I think I will use the staff today because it just kind of makes me feel more connected to him. And it's more important than ever we get this right because it's iconic. Right? It is so big it doesn't fit anywhere. I'm trying to maneuver it in my small little space here. There we go. I can hold it. Here's my beautiful purple staff. It's got an amethyst on top. It is about 7 feet tall. It makes me feel like a wear props, come from a theater background. When you actually wear the clothes of something or hold the prop, it transforms you, pulls your energy into that vision. Merlin will be here with us soon, and take a few breaths wherever you are. Relax. If you wish to close your eyes, not if you're driving, of course. Be ready for a good story. I am always amused at this channel and her introductions. I enjoy her sense of storytelling and I'm amused. Think of how excited everyone is and how curious you all are to hear of this story. I am eager to tell it. It has come down through history in many, many forms, and each who has been inspired to write of it has focused on some important aspect of it, which is more important in its intention and its demonstration of cosmic wisdom than in what actual facts happen. You must understand, because you are all connected with storytelling in so many forms now through television and various media and films and books. You understand that many times the story becomes more important and more vibrant and more influential than what actually happened. This is sometimes a good thing as intentions and iconic truths are magnified, which can be more easily recognized when something becomes lore or myth. Sometimes it is to the detriment of the story, however, as things are twisted and perverted to suit the agendas of those who wish to communicate their own beliefs on top of the actual intention of the event. And I will cite here one very important thing. The story of Arthur and Camelot is very, very ancient. Throughout the years, many cultures have tried to pin down the time frame of when this happened, and yet archaeology and written records do mention a King Arthur. People have searched for the site of Camelot and claim to have found it, and yet there is no true evidence of where it was. This is due to the fact that these events happened far, far before your recorded history and have been passed down orally in tradition and attributed to different time periods as each culture heard the story. You know the whole process of the game telephone. As things are passed down, they are altered to suit the teller listener. One of the big things that happened here is that as people tried to pin Arthur's story and legend to the time after the Roman, as Christianity was sweeping into the British Isles and taking over from Roman and pagan religions and nature religions and spirituality, or sometimes to the 1100s or 1200s in medieval times, where Christianity had a solid hold on the consciousness of Western Europe. Those who were powerful people in the Christian religion got their hands on this story and began to make changes that suited their own belief systems. And one of the big changes was to cast all the women in the story as villains, which they also did with the story of Adam and Eve, if you can think of the connection. Always, men were always in charge of the narratives in these times. And Christianity was very much about a patriarchal society where male figures held the power and were in a position of cleansing, saving, uplifting, while the women were sources of temptation, sexual temptation, prone to making errors, to being faithless, emotional, incapable of higher thought or higher spiritual knowledge. This was all in the Christian agenda, and I do not mean it by any means to slight Jesus, our wonderful Master Jesus, who brought the Christ light in and is another example of a tale, a story, an event which was significant and then corrupted to fit the agendas of the people between the event and this time. In that story also, many of the women were cast as villains. Magdalene. These were not truths. These were inserted to support the vision of the men in charge who wished to subjugate women and mark them as dangerous and worthy of being subdued. And so you will hear me refer to this when I relate some of the facts of Arthur's legend to you as they happened, and you will see the pattern here. And hopefully you will be illuminated and joyful to hear that women were not the cause of another fall. And so where I had left you off, Atlantis, maybe if you do want some time frames, the golden years of Atlantis might have been in your Earth time 10,000 years ago or so, very far, far outside of your collective memory, except deep in your DNA. After 1,500 years of high energy, multidimensional, golden time, Atlantis fell. It slowly crumbled under the pressure of growing egos, fears and doubts, shame and guilt, selfishness and greed, all those things that creep in fleshly creations with egos when they are not properly balanced and disciplined with spiritual truths. Those that could, those before and after the fall, collected the artifacts they could, the wisdom and books, crystals and knowledge, which they could save and spread to the four corners of the earth, and set up temples or secret societies or priestly gatherings. And we are focusing now on the British Isles, where I went with many of my colleagues and focused our efforts on creating the center of spiritual preservation and growth and education on the island of Avalon, which was then protected by the energies we still knew how to wield from our time in Atlantis and made invisible to the lower vibrational energies of the people evolving on that territory on a separate track. There were many of us from Atlantis who practiced our own rituals, healing methods, and we adapted to our environment and we found materials in the local area, built temples and cosmic sites, as you well know, and wielded energies and cleansed areas. We found and seeded herbal healing plants. We preserved as much as we could of the ancient wisdom that we remembered, both orally and in our minds and memories, and various kinds of crystals, paper, scrolls. We taught the generations that came from us. Some of us elected to live out our lives and pass on to the great beyond. I elected to continue regenerating the body that I had so that I could be in a leadership position and hold this school safe and hold this place inviolate from outside forces and darkness that swept over the continent. And so this will answer one of your questions. I had learned some very potent regenerating processes, which were very taxing to perform, but which kept me alive in my fleshly body for many thousands of years. It is difficult for your mind to grasp this, but Atlantis was filled with many gifts and powers that you have not yet remembered or, and I was able to do this many times over. This led to the popular myth that I have been living my life backwards. And yes, during Arthur's time, there were people who saw me as a wizened old man, and then perhaps the next time they saw me, I somehow looked younger because I had undergone a regeneration process. If you are familiar with your pop culture story of Doctor Who, there may be some similarity there in this regeneration process. It involves energy and crystals and intention and effusions of various kinds of coded energies, except that I usually would keep my same so as not to confuse those I was working with. As I have told you before, this was the last time I chose to be in a physical body, although I have overshadowed some along the way for a brief time. If some of the people I knew would see me looking frail and old, and then a year later see me looking energized and younger, they would say, Merlin is magical. He gets younger every time we see him. All they were seeing was the result of a process whereby I would refresh myself for the next 100 years. And so we went along. In our little multidimensional bubble on Avalon, we did not always understand the passage of time on the outside world. You will understand that time may perhaps have passed in a different speed behind the veils that we were constructing to protect ourselves and on the outside as evolution proceeded. And so this is one reason I cannot tell you precisely in what year all of these events happened. But I will tell you it was a brutal time on Earth, outside of the alcoves where the Atlanteans had established themselves. Human beings still had great potential, great artistry and creativity and great aspiration, but they were lost in a sense of fear, darkness, privation, war, and conflict. There were wars. There were people who wanted to grab power at any cost. There were people who treated women brutally, and there were people who treated the earth as their possession and the animals on it as merely something to attack or kill. We were in communication with higher vibrational energies, and there were even then councils of archangels and masters who put their heads together and thought that Earth was not a lost cause, and it was important to move the populations towards remembrance, higher vibration existence, community, and understanding love as a force of Christ. And so they put together plans for bringing forward leaders, teachers, Kohans, masters of light, of love, of peacefulness and gentleness, who would come and set examples. And these who volunteered for the job were highly advanced, but they were to be born into the earth with a certain loss of memory, a certain veil, which was always the case when one is born. But they were so powerful that they were able to, through spiritual discipline and study, access some of their original soul energies and memories and knowledge, and connect themselves with messages from above. But it was not an automatic thing. They may have been slightly more advanced. They worked hard to access more of the original skills that humanity was meant to have. But it was not an easy road for them. They also realized that they would be coming into a world which would reject and be frightened of them, ultimately harm them. And so you might call it suicide mission, so to speak, but something very important, which needed to come about on the earth to show the citizens of earth that they did not have to remain mired in the lower energies that were keeping them from evolving or remembering who they were. And of course, Jesus is one of the people who came to set that example. The Buddha was another in another part of the world. And there were others scattered about, not all of which this channel is aware of. But Arthur was another. And Arthur's mission was to come into this very primitive and warlike atmosphere as one of the people, as a warrior, as a strong male leader, but one who embraced his feminine side, one who embraced gentleness, one who embraced the qualities and values of peace, of love, of helpfulness, of empathy, and one who showed that one could lead not by brutality and bullying alone, but and not by violence alone or the might of the sword, but by thought, by spirit, heart-centered caring, by assembling people with a code of consciousness which protected the weak, which used strength in order to build, in order to protect the vulnerable, and not just to pound them into the ground. Not to use people, but to elevate people, to allow them to have a golden age of artistry and creativity, plenty and abundance and sharing, of community, of celebration. And therefore, seeing this example working and prospering, and seeing all of the practical benefits that could be had from a surcease of violence, and from a sense of lifting up the citizenry into their highest forms of expression and protecting this and holding the vision that humanity itself would move forward. And so plans were made. And because I was already there and I was someone who had skills and powers that I had brought with me from the Golden Age, I was chosen to be a mentor and a teacher and a helper for this leader who was to come through. You understand it was not possible for me to do this myself, for I would not have come from the people, and I was not a warrior, and no one would have trusted someone who came, who looked to them as a god or a magician because of extra powers and skills. They needed to see someone of their own type who was especially courageous, especially curious, especially firm, especially likable, who would be an example to them to aspire to. Not a god to worship, but a leader to follow, to lay down one's life for, and to emulate. This was the plan. So now we come to the details of the legend. How was this person to come into the world? There was at the time in England a king named Uther Pendragon, and he was strong, and he had united many areas, and he had won the respect of his people. He was a warrior. He had a certain amount of brutality, but he also was a wise and educated person who had access to some of the old wisdom. He understood the value of peace and how it was linked to prosperity. He had many good qualities. Genetically, he would make a very good father for this person to come, it was decided, and he would also be in a position to pass his kingdom down to a son without much conflict. Who was to be the mother of this child, however? Uther had been married and had no children and a wife who passed away. He was in search of a new mate. But the cosmos decided that the mother energy for Arthur would be the beautiful Igraine. Igraine had studied some at the school in Avalon. We did accept very advanced and kind and curious students of male and female persuasion to learn certain skills, healing, wisdom, spiritual traditions, not the most secret of rituals, but Igraine knew much, and he was curious, and Igraine was very connected with her higher self and source. And she was a loving and nurturing soul who had been unfortunately married to a warlord named Lord Gorlois, who was much older than she. She was his second wife. He treated her like chattel, not lovingly at all, and wished for her to give him sons because she was so beautiful. You may see her now, very tall and shapely, strawberry blonde hair and pale skin, and blue eyes, which pierced into the mysteries of the universe. A sense of calm and serenity about her, a sense of accepting her fate in this culture which did not value women as equals, but a longing for more, a longing to know more, to participate more, and a connection with soul. So she was not, the legend has it that I had Uther come to her in a magical disguise as her husband so that she would submit to him and therefore become pregnant. It was a stormy night on the cliffs in Wales, but it was not you will see that the Christians wished to take blame from her. So they made it that she thought it was her husband who was magically transformed, but it was really Uther. This was nonsense. Igraine knew. I had spoken to her of her part of this mission and how important it was. And everyone involved understood that her marriage was not a marriage of choice. The story also goes that Uther, wanting Igraine for himself, sent her husband off to war in a position he knew would kill him. This they borrowed from the ancient story of King David and Bathsheba, where David also wished to have Bathsheba for himself and sent Uriah, her husband, off to be killed in the war on purpose. And so this is a legend that comes down through many forms, but was not the case here. It was applied to this story in order to take any guilt away from Igraine in the Christian view. But in fact, it was a brutal time, and Gorlois was a warrior and young. And so it was fateful and pre-known that his would not be a long life, and that Igraine would eventually be able to marry with Uther, and their son would grow up to be the leader the cosmos wished to make a difference in the world. And so, yes, I was instrumental in arranging their meeting, their privacy. But Igraine knew from the start that she was selected for a mission. We cannot blame her for being faithless or unmindful of her vows, because it was a time when women had no power to make those decisions on their own. Her husband was shortly killed, and Igraine gave birth to a healthy baby boy, who was Uther's son. And therefore, the genetic part of this experiment was complete. But my intelligence, and in consultation with the councils of light, came to the conclusion that the child would not be safe. For there were many warlords vying for Uther's position, and once his son was vulnerable and a baby, it would be very advantageous for one of these warlords to arrange to kill the heir to the throne. And so very shortly thereafter, I was elected to take the baby and put him in a foster home that none knew of except his mother, which was the house of Sir Ector, a lower lord who had a modest farm and a good family and some cattle, not far from where Stonehenge is, not too far from Avalon. And I watched over the child. And as he grew, I was his teacher, his tutor, his mentor. And I taught him concepts that no one in his time would probably have understood. Concepts about light and energy, about connection and oneness. Concepts about love, the power of love, power of peace, power of community. And I would bring him into the ancient forests and spend time among the ancient trees, which were still inhabited by tree spirits. And there were fairies, and there were wild creatures who were unafraid because of the denseness of the forest. And there were animals who could teach lessons of wisdom and stealth, power, of balance and moderation, of perception, of patience. And we spent time with all of these. And we spent time at the running brooks, watching the water flow. And we spent time with the plants. And when he was old enough, I took him in the boat to Avalon, through the veils which were still, keeping the place invisible and unknown to most. And among the Druids and the last of the Atlanteans, Arthur learned very evolved precepts, whatever we thought he was ready to learn. But as we had thought, because of his lineage, he was not a monk or a scholar by nature. He was an apt student and wished to please and had a good mind, but he was also a very physical child, needed to learn, to be strong and healthy, keep his body in good shape. And that's where Sir Ector and his family came to bear, teaching the young boy swordplay, physical fitness, wrestling, the protocols of the culture and the royal court. Arthur did not know he was the heir to the throne, but he did know that he was being taught many things and being kept separate from most other children and most other people. Sometimes it rankled him, and sometimes he wished that he could have playmates or understand why he seemed to be treated differently than the other children in the family. We did not tell him everything, but we told him he had a destiny. This was something beyond his comprehension in the beginning, but he did enjoy the learning that we did in the out of doors especially. And when he got restless with any sort of recitations or memory or rituals, we would always take him back to the forest, where he could climb a tree and look into the eyes of an owl, or play with a frog, but still garner some message from that interaction. And he learned to be wise and kind and gentle. And he learned that women and men were equal, equally intelligent, equally to be revered and protected and respected, and that creatures were to be respected and Mother Earth was to be respected. And he learned about the energies from source. And yes, there was an incident that involved the sword and the stone. As Uther became old and sick, I have not mentioned that Igraine, Arthur's mother, did come and visit him throughout his life and provided him with a beautiful, nurturing spirit. She did not tell him she was his mother, but he knew her as a loving aunt, a loving force in his life, who was always there to pick him up if he fell, to hug him, to show him unconditional love. She fulfilled her task beautifully well. And when Uther eventually died, secure in the knowledge that his son would take his place as I had promised him, eventually she retired to the healing halls of Avalon and became a priestess with us, but also visited her son on occasion. That is her story. And she was very valuable in our number, our community, and a perfect mother figure, mother goddess for the growing youngster. Arthur was only perhaps 14 or so by your years when his father died. And there was a great convocation called of all of the highest level warlords in all of the surrounding areas, all of the states, the regions of England, which were interacting and trading with each other at the time. And there were many powerful warlords who thought they deserved to be the next leader of all. And they vied for attention and tried to drum up support from their colleagues. But we knew what was planned. And so we had to set up something that no one could argue with. It would not have been all right just to bring Arthur forward and say, this is actually the son of Uther, and here is the proof, because someone would have killed him right off the bat, and that would have been that. So we had to set up something that seemed magical, that seemed like you could not argue with it. And there's where a little bit of trickery of my own, a little bit of sleight of hand, you could say, and a little transmutation of matter and energy did the trick. There is still some fear and respect for magic in the world at the time. And so at the convocation, I, was well known as a teacher and a mentor, and had inspired more than a little fear in the people around, set up a large stone with a sword that I had buried in the stone almost up to its hilt. And I put an energy field around it so that it was impossible to pull the sword out of the stone. The convocation was held so that there could be discussions over who would lead, and there were to be also competitions of strength, of weaponry. It was not precisely as you hear, because we are not talking about the storied medieval times with jousts and such. But there were sword fights and wrestling. There were injuries. There were people who beat other people and thought that their physical feats of strength would win them. I had made a decree, a proclamation, that he who could remove the sword from the stone would be the rightful heir and king of all England. And everyone agreed to it. As I said, there was still some respect for magic. And so one by one, each of the warlords, each of the contenders tried to pull the sword from the stone with their greatest amount of strength. But I arranged for it so that the harder they tried, the more effort, the more sweat they exerted on the sword, the more stuck it would be, the more resistant it would be. It is a neat trick of energies, of balance, of magnetism. But I knew that all of those people would think that brawn alone would win the day, and so they would use every muscle except the muscle of their mind, and that would ensure that none of them would succeed. And so it arrived that Sir Ector himself was engaged in some of the war games that were happening at the convocation for entertainment purposes and for competition purposes, and his own sword broke. And being a loyal foster son of Sir Ector and loving his foster father, Arthur, in all innocence, said to his foster father, "Stay there. I have seen another sword I will bring to you so that you may continue your competition." And Arthur ran back to the stone, not really realizing its significance, and quite easily, under my watchful eye, pulled the sword out, as I had always intended. Well, instead of giving it to his foster father, it was a huge, shining beacon to everyone at the convocation. Reluctantly, all fell on their knees to this boy, at which point it was revealed who his lineage came from, and how he was Uther's son and the rightful heir to the throne. Arthur himself was shocked, but everything began to fall in place in his mind of how he had been educated and held apart, and how he had been prepared all his life for this day. At that age, he would not be ready to take full command of everything. But I was by his side always in those days, and his mother was also nearby, and all the druids and the priestesses from Avalon, and many trusted advisors, such as Sir Ector himself and his son Kay. And so Arthur grew into his position, and this part of his life was about growth and exploration, trial and error. But he was a very, as I said, an apt pupil, and also a strong-minded and strong-bodied youth with ideas in his head that had never been tried. And so here we are at the place where Arthur begins his most important mission, which is to show the world a template for a new kind of existence in a brutal world, a template for gentleness and peace and love and community. Little by little, seeing the privation around him and the cruelty around him and the way people treated one another, the way people treated the poor, the orphans, the widows, the way they treated their animals, how they killed each other over a little provocation, how they seemed not to think at all of the common good in times of drought or need, but always just of themselves. And he thought, my kingdom will not be, by default, something that continues these trends. We will make a kingdom where there are new precepts, there are new values, and we will try to elevate ourselves and live up to these values. It will not just be about myself being in a position of authority, greatness, and ego. It will be about the most impressive collection of wise and skilled and loyal and courageous people ever assembled to support this vision and protect it and keep it safe and growing so that it could spread all over England and become normal. It was then that he met Guinevere. Many of you asked about Guinevere. Igraine knew Guinevere because Guinevere had also come to Avalon. Her father allowed her to go for education, and she had learned also healing arts, and she had learned wisdom. She was a very, very smart girl. And so she also had memories of Atlantis. She also had a memory of being wise and filled with light. And she took time to walk in the woods and connect with her higher self and find serenity and peace. But she had a fierceness to her also, which would brook no idiocy and no bullying from anyone. She was an independent soul, and Arthur found her appealing, as was always meant to be, for their souls knew each other well on the other side. They were from the same soul family. And so Arthur married Guinevere, and she took his hand gladly, for they were so well matched. And she realized that Arthur would give her the opportunity to influence his decision-making and to have an equal say as an equal partner in not only their relationship, but in their vision for the kingdom. And Arthur was happy to share his vision with someone who had much to contribute, that sparked his imagination and that helped him to understand the plight of others in his kingdom. For she was a woman of great compassion and empathy. And they were a wonderful team, and their equality in their relationship inspired many and helped the men of the time see their women in a different light. Some actually were able to think now of women as equal, or at least as complements who had value other than just physical. And some of the men who were closest to Arthur began to want to pass that new vision of the sexes and the genders by protecting the women, not because they were weaker or helpless, but because they deserved to be valued and uplifted because of all they had to contribute. So this new innovation that Arthur and Guinevere began spread like a virus, as you say, a computer virus. But it was a new way of living. But since it resulted in more happiness and more good ideas implemented, more prosperity, more sense of peacefulness and serenity in every community, there were always those who resisted, who wanted the old ways and who wanted to use their women as chattel. But more and more people began to treat each other with respect and kindness just by seeing a model of this in front of their eyes, which they had never seen before, and seeing how well it worked and what it produced. Sadly, it produced many visions and ideas and dreams and much good works, the building of wells, the building of fortified walls to protect communities, the teaching of healing arts, and the flourishing, as usually happens in times like this, of music and theater and writing and artistic and craft guilds, crafting more beautiful things. There were more artists at leisure who were able to create and sell their wares or perform. there was more stability in many communities. But unfortunately, what did not come from this marriage were children. For Guinevere did not have the physical ability to bear children. This was known in the councils. Though it was a sadness for Arthur and Guinevere, they focused their creative intentions upon their dream as their child, instead of being distracted by raising children. They raised a whole country from infancy. Now, somewhere along these lines in the very beginning, Arthur had kept the sword that he took from the stone, and yet it was not such a very important sword except for what had happened to it. It had a symbolic value and was better on a wall somewhere to commemorate his ascension to the throne. But it was not really a sword that was meant as a great battle functional weapon, one that would protect Arthur and his people in time of attack, which was still something they needed to guard against from outside. And so it was also decided among the Druids and the people of Avalon, and consultation with the councils, that we would allow Arthur to use an artifact we had brought from Atlantis. And this was a sword, or more of a ritual sword, as the Atlanteans did not go to war very often. But it was a sword that was forged with the greatest technology from metals that come from cosmic meteorites. The blade was strong, filled with energetic code, and sharpened by technology that did not exist in Arthur's time to a very fine edge. It was lighter than the metals that were in use back then. And it was decided that this would cement Arthur's legitimacy, set him apart, and that it was time to bring it out of storage. And so we prayed over it and we infused it with energies of protection and healing. It was not necessarily magical in the sense of guaranteeing, as the legends have it, that it would always be triumphant. But it was definitely made from materials that had never been seen in those days, and it was definitely infused with energies. And when we had prepared it for his use, it was determined that it would be given to him in a sort of magical way in front of everyone's eyes, which would also help his legitimacy in front of the people who are still mired in belief and superstition. If they saw something they deemed supernatural or magical, Arthur would be revered and followed, and just that much more of an example to them to follow. And so Arthur rode out to the center of the lake where Avalon existed, but Avalon could not be seen because it was shrouded in the mists that we produced to keep it safe and in another dimensional realm. And on the other side, we put the sword in a boat and brought the high priestess, the Lady of the Lake, from Avalon, and sailed to meet Arthur's boat. And when we came to the veil, the place where the veil kept prying eyes from seeing the realm of Avalon, we stopped the boat, and our high priestess held up the Atlantean sword and pushed her hand through the veil. This was the magic that was talked about for centuries and centuries after. And everyone on the shores gathered to see this magical transfer of power to Arthur, saw a bare arm come out of thin air, holding Excalibur, the most remarkable shining sword they had ever seen, looking as if it had come from another time and place, for indeed it had. And Arthur accepting the gift from the disembodied arm, from the Lady of the Lake, and a cheer went up, and the device had its desired effect, which was fealty to Arthur, who obviously was favored by the gods. Were we not clever? Yes, we laugh a little bit to see how easily people were fooled, and yet it was all with the best of intentions. Perhaps you will say we were manipulative, but it was for the best of reason, to get the people's attention and turn it away from their petty bickering to a higher vision of what was possible for themselves. Guinevere's father had, as a wedding present, had a giant table crafted at Arthur's request, which was entirely round, the round table. This was a true thing, and it was so that Arthur could say to the people he assembled that he respected, we are equals at this table. Your views, your input is highly respected and welcome. Nobody is dominant over another. And so the round table became a symbol of community, of cooperation, and of equality and respect for one another. And Arthur held regular convocations at that table, especially in time of difficulty or need or tough decisions, in any case, always, because he wished to assemble what he thought of as the best minds, the best arms, the best courageous and loyal friends together from all over not only Britain, but wherever the word spread and people would come to ask for admission. And they would pass many tests before they would have a seat at the table. But many did. It was not just a few. It was a very large table, and many were asked to sit at it. And all of their input was welcome and respected and discussed. This was totally new. Autocracy and one man laying down edicts for his own benefit was the way of the world. And now we could see a new way, a way of discussion where compromises could be made, where ideas were brainstormed and were fertile, things that one man had not thought of that another had, that one man could think of and another could implement. It was about putting together all of the skills of many to create a vision that was bigger and a reality that was bigger than any one of them create or support. This was a golden time. It was a very golden time. It was a golden time where the people were in peace and they prospered. The lots of everyone's life improved, where public works were done, where protection was held on streets so that trade could happen safely, where the knights of the Round Table, and we called them knights, which was a word that came from much, much later to describe them, but they were Arthur's cabinet, so to speak. And those that were warriors were placed in places where they would stop banditry, where they would where they would be lookouts for any foreign invaders, where they would protect the vulnerable and stop petty theft, where they would also welcome those who came from far to join the company. They would practice their physical arts, and they would work hard at studying spiritual and mental exercise as well. And many of them were musicians, were poets, were artists, and many were in touch with animals, were good with horses or dogs. Many were builders and creators, city planners, and they built a beautiful city on a hill. And people worked there and were paid to work there. There were no slaves. The labor was difficult, but the vision was beautiful. And the town that sprung up around it was prosperous. And trade flourished. And for a very long time, there were no outside attacks. And Arthur became known because when there were attempts at outside attacks from other civilizations, he was able to gather the best of the best and put them down easily, without much loss. And his sword was always raised, the shining sword of Atlantis and Avalon, which inspired his men to be courageous and to passionately defend what they had built. And so for many decades, this land flourished and grew, and the legends of their exploits grew as well as some of the knights went to visit their own homes and spread the word of what happened in Camelot, wanting to inspire other places to follow their lead to create similar satellite cities, to create councils, and to create communities which could prosper in this same way. And they brought their wisdom and taught others so that the ideas spread like a spider's web or ripples from the center. And for a short time, there was beauty in the world. There was peace in the world. There was respect, reverence for life, parity of gender, safety for the people, and opportunity to improve their lives and to become all they were meant to be. It was a beginning. It was a great success. And Arthur was at the helm, and Guinevere was by his side. Now, let's see. Next. Lancelot was another example of the Christian church much later attributing the fall of this beautiful time to a woman and her faithlessness. This was a habit of the church to blame anything that went awry on the inconstancy of women. It was not the case at all. Guinevere was Arthur's partner fully, always. Lancelot came into the picture having heard legends all the way from his home in Brittany, in France, or what was later to become France, rode a great distance to join the round table and passed all of the tests. He was young, very young, and he was extremely well versed in weaponry, in fighting, but he was a smart boy and not at all exposed to any of the great wisdom and the concepts and the vision. He had heard about it, and something sparked in his heart, and he wished to be a part of this grand vision. And not having any children of her own, Guinevere took him under her wing, something of a godmother, perhaps, their age difference being maybe 10 years or so. And she spent a great deal of time with him, walking in the gardens and explaining to him the things that she had learned in Avalon and the greater concepts, and discussing things and answering his questions. And so they were together a great deal, and she was very fond of him, almost like the mother would be. And Arthur became also very fond of him and very dependent on him because of his youthful energy, excitement, and his rashness, which had to be calmed at times, but also his fertility of ideas and his belief that everything was possible. And so he became rather a very valued member of the Round Table. In the story you have heard, Lancelot and Guinevere have an illicit love affair that brings the whole thing down. And this was never the truth. Again, it was the Christian church's way of blaming things on a woman. In fact, Lancelot was an integral part of the beautiful time. And he was chosen to bring it forward into more places and more times had things gone a different way. And now we come to Mordred. Mordred is said to have been an illegitimate son of Arthur's from some magical union with Morgan Le Fay. And yes, there was a Morgan Le Fay or a Morgana, and she was the wife of another lord who was not happy with the way things were and wanted more power for himself and his own nation state. And his wife was somewhat versed in witchcraft and was also egotistical and conniving and manipulative, and was always trying to arrange schemes that would ruin the plans of Arthur and his court so that it would look as if the Round Table vision could not work, and that it would be important for someone more firm and manly, her husband, to take over. Morgan made much, much trouble over the time Arthur was there, and she did cause problems, but also she did not have the powers that people ascribed to her to bring the whole thing down. One of her sons was Mordred, it is true, and Mordred was fostered at the court of Camelot, as was the custom of the time. Morgana probably thought that having a son in the court of Arthur would be a good way to get information and spy. But Mordred was also a tender youngster and was inspired by the vision, and Arthur also took him under his wing and taught him things and spent time with him, answered his questions, and found him to be a bright, and appealing, did not blame Mordred for his mother's manipulations, but tried to show him a different way of seeing so that he would not adopt his mother's influence and become like. It was an act of charity to try to save the soul of this young man who had great potential but was being manipulated by a family who had darker ideas. And this was the fatal flaw. Mordred is a sort of a Judas character in this story, and they had the same function and the same basic fatal flaw in that each of them was excited about being attached to the great dream, but they had been early on educated to expect more physical, uh, more glamour, more physical results. In Judas's case, we know that he thought that Jesus would rise up and cast the Romans out and physically save the Israelites from the oppression they were under. But Jesus' intentions were never that. He was a man of peace. And he showed a different way that Judas did not understand because he was a younger soul who did not understand the concepts of seeing the vision from a different perspective, a higher perspective, and only wanted the practical result. And when he did not get the practical results he thought that Jesus would deliver, he decided to push Jesus into a corner, having him arrested, but never believed that Jesus would be actually executed and that Jesus would refuse to fight back. This is why he hung himself in shame, because he did not in a million years believe that his actions would not, he believed they would result in Jesus getting off of his back, so to speak, and being triumphant. Instead, tragedy ensued, and he became hated and reviled by his friends and could not live longer with that burden and what he had done. In Mordred's case, Mordred was at the court and saw everything that was going on and wished to be in a position of power, but had much to learn and did not understand many of the concepts that he was being taught. He was a practical, materialistic young man. He had a quick mind, and he was extremely agile in thought, in planning, in scheming. He started in an innocent way, but his mother had put seeds in his mind that power was important, that holding power, that winning power, that being the first was the most important thing. And eventually, he and Arthur became at odds with one another. Mordred wanted physical power on the earthly plane, and he thought that Arthur was holding everyone back, keeping them always from conquest. Mordred wanted to march out into other areas and conquer other people forcibly. Arthur understood that this was not the mission. And Mordred rounded up his own army of young, hungry, ambitious young men who wanted more power and more glory and were already leaning towards the old patriarchal vision of things, where might made right and power gave you glory and recognition and riches. Mordred eventually, growing into a young man, decided that Camelot was ill run and was holding back the progress of the whole country. He thought he would be the one to take it in a new direction. And as Arthur was aging, he thought he could face Arthur down and get him to step aside. Arthur had more in store for him. They met each other on the field at Camelot, and the two armies faced off against each other. Arthur with his Excalibur and surrounded by his knights, his cabinet, and his army of people who would fight for the peace and the continuation of the dream. And Mordred with his young, ambitious, impatient army that wanted earthly glory and power. And yet there was still a bond between them. And so there was a moment when Arthur brought to bear all of the energies at his disposal. The Christ light, the light of peace, the violet flame, everything he could access that he had learned of to bring peace and harmony to the situation, calling forth etheric presence of angels, peace. and the energies of peace, and offering to discuss and talk about what would assuage Mordred's ambition. But the stories are true that the young men were fidgety, and when a snake appeared, it's always a snake, isn't it? The poor snake is always blamed as well. But the story has it, and I believe it true, that some person pulled a sword in order to protect themselves from some wild creature. It was an unconscious reactive move, but that pulling of the sword spoiled the moment of discussion, peace, of harmony, and where something perhaps might have been worked out, instead, a bloody battle ensued, and many were killed. Many brothers in arms, many comrades, many fathers and sons, many of the round table, most of Mordred hosts, because they were young and inexperienced, either were killed or fled or grievously wounded, and they gave up their ambitions. Many of Arthur's seasoned warriors were also grievously wounded or killed. Arthur himself faced off with Mordred and hesitated as long as he could, but when Mordred wounded him grievously, without a thought for their relationship, Arthur killed him, feeling that this soul would not be able to be turned in that life. Did Arthur die there? No. The story has it that priestesses from Avalon came. He was brought by his closest surviving counselors to the shores of the lake, and the priestesses from Avalon came, and they took his unconscious body in the boat and brought it to Avalon to apply all of their healing abilities, and they took back the sword Excalibur back to the storage where they had kept it safe through all the time since Atlantis. And they worked hard to keep Arthur from dying, and they succeeded. But Arthur was done. The experiment had been beautiful, but it had crumbled. So many died, and he, again, the poisoned seed of human ego, human ambition, human fascination with power and glory, meant that it was not yet time for a place like Camelot to exist for long. As Atlantis had fell, Camelot had fallen much more swiftly, and Arthur was tired and did not wish to rebuild it again. Little by little, the gains that they had made fell apart, and only the memory of what had happened there and the moment of life and the moment of inspiration survived. And what happened to everyone? Some of the knights went off on quests to try to apply their spiritual knowledge in something higher than just survival. Lancelot was one. He had many adventures, but he ended up joining some sort of a spiritual community himself after a long grieving period where people said he had gone mad because he had lost everything he valued most in the world. He did find a way to meditate and be a sort of a spiritual teacher, to pass on the wisdom he had learned from Guinevere. And Guinevere retired to Avalon with Arthur, and Igraine was still there, very aged, but still there, master healer. And Arthur stayed as well and healed very, very, very slowly, and became a student and a scholar, and lived out his life in quiet contemplation. And he was allowed to do so because of having devoted his entire life to the mission that the council and myself had placed upon him. And so he lived for more years and passed away peacefully in Avalon. But the legend has that he would always come back and rescue Britain. He has been back in many lifetimes as a great leader, always trying to bring the light and always trying to teach about equality and community and peace and prosperity and cooperation and the protection of ideals. And I believe that he has been back in some forms that you will recognize, notably John Adams in the American experiment, John Adams, who advocated for taking away slavery right at the beginning of the American experiment, for freedom and for no slavery. Failed at this, but he advocated for it, and he helped to run the country in its infancy, just as Arthur did. Abraham Lincoln was also an aspect of Arthur. He had to come to the realization of what was right. It took him a lifetime to actually realize that it was time for a major shift in the economy of the country, that slavery was wickedness that he needed to abolish. Once again, he was killed early in his career. There is patterns here, of course. These souls come to bring information and a new way and a new perspective that is so foreign to the way that the populace thinks, and so threatening to their way of life that in many cases they turn on the messenger and he is robbed of his life, but not before his message is heard and passed down and makes an impact on the future. Now, you will ask, there are a few loose ends here. Where was I in Camelot? Why was I not there beside Arthur to help him make better decisions, or to govern Mordred, or to be by his side at least, or to shield him? And you know the story perhaps of Nimue, who is supposedly a witch or a nymph, who is much younger than I, and who pretends to be an avid student, and then traps me in a cave somewhere where I am stuck forever and not able to help Arthur. And it is from the deviousness of an evil woman. Once again, you will see the Christians had their way with blaming all the women for causing all the problems. See? Nimue was instead a colleague of mine from Atlanta. And somewhere during Arthur's reign, as I was enjoying being his mentor, things were sort of running themselves. And it was Nimue who came to me and said, Arthur, you have regenerated so many times, your physical body is done. You will not be able to extend the life of this body for much longer. You have done your job, and you can do much more good from a position of your light. And so make your ascension now. Leave him to run his country and come into the light with us so that we can work together with the councils and that we can oversee things and do so much more than we can do when we are flesh, earth. And she was so persuasive that I agreed. And with some regret, I made my farewell and then transmuted myself into life, where you see me now, playing my part and working on many dimensional levels to help the earth continue to move forward to its ascension back to a golden age. It has been millennia that I have waited for the golden years of Atlantis to return, but it is within reach now. All of the teachers, all of the leaders who have come forward to show us for just a moment even a vision of what is possible. And we remember them and we speak of them because in all of our hearts we know it is possible and that it has been and will be again, and that hope and imagination and trust and belief and reaching for the best of who we are and remembering who we are will always, always bring us a step closer to becoming the superhumans that we were meant to be, rising out of our own misery, our own self-created misery, our own entrapment in the astral muck, in the cycles of violence and ego and pain and suffering, but instead to transmute humanity to a place where even fleshly form can exist with the energy of love, reverence for life, light, cooperation, community, sharing, freedom, equality, creativity, and all the divine attributes that we were given as souls that we wish so much to express with gratitude and with joy. Sometimes remembering what was and remembering the moments that sparked our imagination and remembering that even for a moment something could be sustained that was an alternative to how humans often behave, is the impetus that we need to keep moving forward and keep believing that it can be done again and done better and done permanently. So this is why I come to you with the facts about the story, as many as I can remember, and the purpose behind it, which you will understand is to drive you forward and to have you hang on and study hard and do your homework and be ready to be leaders all, to be ready to all be Arthurs, to all be Guinevere's, to all be Igraines and Lancelots, to shine your light on a new way of doing things so that all can see that it is the better way, so that people will fall in step behind you, and you all together create a new Camelot, a new Avalon, a new Atlantis, a new golden age for humanity. And now it is not hundreds of years away. Now it is a mere decade before you will see some of the fruits of your labors, if all things move the way we plan them. And we are always at your side, encouraging, whispering in your ear, smoothing the path, helping you to remember how strong, how skilled, and how gifted you all are. And this time, I promise, you will not be abandoned in the moments of greatest stress and trauma. You will not shoulder those moments all alone, where there will be legions of light beings beside you that you may hold hands with and work together to create a new earth. I thank you for listening to this long tale. And once again, if you have other questions that I have not spoken to, you may write them in the comments of this post, and we will try to address them at a future time or write something to you to clarify. We hope that you have come away with more understanding and also inspiration. We leave you with great love and with great confidence that you are the future. You are the new man and woman already, not yet, and soon to be. I take my leave. Right, we have an hour and a half already, and that was completely just talk, but lots and lots of details. So I hope they rang true for you. And if anything did not ring true, just as you said, if you have more questions or more to add or something that you felt or saw or heard while you were getting this download, please write it down and I will try to address it at some point. I hope this made sense to you. It was a lot of light bulb moments for me because, he would say, this is why this happened. And I would be like, oh my God, of course. Why didn't I think of that? It's so wonderful to actually understand what and how it really happened. And also not to have villains in the story the way it was before. I love you all. And I thank you for coming. And if you're here on the recording or the replay, same applies to you. And I hope that you each have a wonderful weekend ahead of you and that you find the memories of this discussion inspiring. As Merlin said, you will feel like anything is actually possible and will come to pass. No matter what you see on the news, no matter what you see around you, no matter what some of the days are where you just feel like, you know, but it will happen. And we're all part of it. Very exciting. Take care. See you again soon.